Good. How are you?
Okay, we'll get started. We're going to go back, pick up on 197 at line 9, verse 9. Yeah, so this discussion is still, can the worker add something to the produce that they're eating? And we're actually going to approach it from a slightly different way today, where it's not so much can the worker add something like salt or sugar. We talked about maybe stuffing 2 at a time, all the different restrictions there might be on the worker's right to eat. So you'll see we're going to come at it from a slightly different direction. It's not so much can the worker add something or not add something, but it's when does adding something make it a liability for taxation, for tithing. Because remember, the whole idea is that the worker's eating on the job is not subject to tithes. But if the worker turns it into a meal, with a little salt, cooks it a little bit, then is enjoying it a little too much, then maybe you're enjoying it. So maybe you're allowed to do it, but at that point it becomes subject to tithing. And since it becomes subject to tithing, maybe the worker then wouldn't do it. So that's so it's interesting because that's sort of social policy, right? I mean, social policy sometimes with taxation doesn't forbid certain things, but it attempts to move the individual citizen in a certain direction the government wants without actually outlawing it. So that's a lot of the climate change legislation that's been attempted anyway is not so much to make it illegal to spew all these gases into the atmosphere, but have a greater cost, a greater economic cost, and then discourage that behavior. So that's also something they'll talk about here too. Is it possible to discourage the behavior, not to forbid it, but to discourage it? Anyhow, so that's what I found ever kind of going through this. Page 197, verse 9. So we start with a statement: Lo yispot b'melach li'ochal, that you are not allowed to dip the produce that you're picking into salt and then eat it. Uriminu, but here's a conflicting. Riminu means we're going to introduce now a conflicting teaching, a conflicting baraita, a baraita that contradicts what we just taught, and then they're going to try to resolve that. Okay, Uriminu. Here's the teaching. Hasocher et poel, you hire a worker, le'ader u'lekashkesh tachad hazeitim, basically to clean up under the olive trees. Okay, so that's not picking. And I remember we talked about before, the whole idea is the worker that's involved in picking the produce is allowed to eat as much as they want, but other workers that are not involved in picking produce are really not supposed to eat. So this is a person that's not harvesting. He's just kind of weeding. Okay, so his hands don't come into direct contact with the fruit, with the product in the course of his work. So it's logical that he would be treated differently, and also the Torah specifically doesn't mention that kind of worker. The Torah mentions the person who is picking. Okay? Anyhow, so you hire somebody to do that. Harei lo yochal. Says that person is not allowed to eat on the job. Okay? Now, changing, it's secharo liftzor. If it's someone's job, now I mentioned last time all these different synonyms for pick, depending on what the product is. So I'm not even going to translate them this time. Each time they're just going to mean pick. It's just that they correspond to a different product, a different fruit. Okay? Secharo liftzor. So if you hired somebody, if he gets paid, secharo gets paid, liftzor, to pick, secharo limsok, to pick, secharo lelakate. Okay, that's to gather. It's a little bit different, but your hands are still involved in touching the produce. Page 198. Hareza ochel. All right, that person is allowed to eat. Okay, which so far no surprises. We've expected that. Upatur. Also, we've learned that person is exempt from paying tithes for those things that he eats. Okay. Shatarazik talahen, because it's a benefit that comes directly from the Torah. There's a verse that tells us that. All right. Now, second sentence, and a lot of here is we're going to have to try to figure out the second sentence and the third sentence, or the second law and the third law, what these apply to. But so far, right now, I just want to figure out what the words means. Katzat. Katzat means he makes a deal with his employer. Okay, so we know what the law is. So we know what the Torah grants the worker and what the Torah doesn't grant the worker. But you're allowed to make side deals with your employer. The employer and the employee can make side deals. So he makes a side deal. Katzat. So it seems to me this is the worker. This is the worker that's just weeding and not actually eating. But he makes a deal with the I'm allowed to eat. That would be the deal with the employer. Achad ve'achad yochal, at that point, if he makes that deal, eat one at a time. Okay? Shtayim lo yochal. But don't put two in your mouth at the same time. Now, of course, you can make a deal that you're going to put two and two, but maybe absent that explicit sense of deal. If the deal is only I can eat on the job, then this teaching is saying he can only eat one at a time, one olive at a time, and not put two in his mouth at the same time. And it's to protect the employer, because that way he's not going to eat as much. Okay? All right. V'sofet b'melech v'yochal. Okay? And there's a vav there. It means and. He can dip it in salt and he can eat. Okay? So that's if he's made the deal. Well, wait a second. So we have this statement that he's made a deal. It's likely the person who's made the deal is the worker who is not picking, because that's the one who's going to want to say, I can eat sometimes. Okay. All right. Now, the last phrase, this is going to be the controversial phrase. The last phrase, which I just said, he can dip it in salt. The question is, what does that refer to? So does that refer to the worker who is not picking the produce, who's made the deal? Or is it referring to the guy who's picking? The guys. So if it's referring to the guy who's picking, it contradicts our previous teaching. Because the previous teaching says that the people, your average ordinary picker, harvester, is not allowed to dip in salt and then eat. Right. But this says he is allowed to, unless it's referring to the other worker who is not the harvester, who's just cleaning up, but who's made the deal. We don't really know. Okay? It's a question of grammar and how you're going to read it. But I will tell you that if it refers to, again, the harvester, the one who's picking, then it conflicts with the previous teaching. Because the previous teaching told us you shouldn't add, he's not allowed to add things. Okay? So this very question brings us into, you believe it or not, into complicated territory. But I'm going to, about tithes. And about the difference between Israel and the diaspora. But we'll take it one step at a time. All right, ahai. Ahai means this last phrase. The last phrase, by the way, is known in Aramaic as the seifa. And we've had that before. Seifa hides the Hebrew word sof. Yeah. Sof means the end. So the final phrase of a Mishnah, because the rabbis have this problem occasionally. They do. I mean, it happens occasionally. You've got a bunch of sentences. There's no periods. There's no punctuation in the Mishnah. We add punctuation ourselves, so sometimes you wonder, what does that last phrase refer to? I mean, there's no semicolon. So you have to just figure out yourself. So ahai means that particular phrase, in which we understand is the last phrase. What is that referring to? Okay, the phrase we're talking about is adding salt. Okay, ilema asefa. Okay, if it's on the seifa, the second. There's usually they divide it up into Resha. Resha is Hebrew also. You hear the Hebrew Rosh, which means the first. Seifa is the second. If you've got two ideas, Resha is the first, Seifa is the second. So if we say, let's try this out. If we say that that you're allowed to eat the salt refers to the one who made the deal. Kevan de katzatz, but wait a second, he's made a deal. Kol hechi debai lechol. You wouldn't need it. You wouldn't need, if we're talking about the guy who made the deal, you wouldn't need that he's allowed to dip in salt because he's going to make the deal. So you don't even need that law, because all you would have to write, and you'd have to just write that in. I get to dip salt in it. I mean, it wouldn't occur to you whether he can dip in salt or not, because he would put that to the deal. So therefore, what they're saying is that he's not allowed. I mean, he's allowed to dip in salt must not refer to that worker. It must refer to the original, to the harvester. Ela lava resha. It must refer to the first clause, which is about the harvester. Okay. Which means that it contradicts our previous statement. So the previous statement was that he's not allowed to dip in salt. Suddenly now you're telling me he is allowed to dip in salt. What's going on here? Okay, does everybody understand the difficulty? Really? Okay, yeah. It's not about blood. It could be. That could be a way to answer it. Okay, we're dealing with one guy's got high blood pressure, one guy's not. And if he's got high blood pressure, he shouldn't be. Maybe it's just a health issue. They come at it from a different direction, but maybe you want to solve it that way. Amar Rabbi says lo kasha. The Rabbi says, okay, it's not a conflict. Kan ba'aretz. One is referring to the land of Israel. Kan b'chutzal haaretz. Now, what he's going to say, and I only know this because I've read ahead in Steinsaltz and Rashi, but the one where you are not allowed to dip in salt, that's in Israel. The one that you are allowed to dip in salt is in the diaspora, and it has to do with tithing. Okay? Now they're going to explain it. Page 199. Now remember, I'm going to have to remind you this, okay? Because you have to keep this distinction in mind. Outside of Israel, well, I'll start with inside of Israel. Of course, you are required to tithe. All of the tithing laws, all the agricultural laws in the Torah depend on being in the land of Israel. Okay? Once you're out of the land of Israel, according to the Torah, there are no agricultural laws. All right? And the rabbis decided that the agricultural laws only apply to the land of Israel. They need Jewish sovereignty. They need not just Jewish sovereignty, but that location, that particular location. Outside of the land of Israel, the Torah doesn't mandate any of those agricultural laws. However, the rabbis are allowed to make their own laws. So rabbis living in Babylonia can decide on their own authority, but for all sorts of reasons, we're going to institute tithing outside of the land of Israel. Or they can decide, we've had this before, that challah, the thing you're baking, you take the piece of bread, you burn it up. Even though that would only apply, well, there's some disagreement about that, but theoretically it would only apply in the land of Israel. The rabbis can decide we'd like it to apply outside of the land of Israel. Okay? So what we've learned before is that they did have some tithing outside of the land of Israel. The Babylonian rabbis did have some, but understood all along that it wasn't a Torah legislation. It wasn't D'oraita, it was D'Rabbanan. Okay, so you have to keep, that's just background. All right, page 199. What he's suggesting, this is the Abai, he's suggesting, Ba'aretz kavasvita. So what Abai is saying, it's not so much that you're not allowed to salt your produce, it's that in the land of Israel, when you salt your produce to make it more tasty, so it's more like a meal, kavah. The word kavah means it's a very important word for us today, and for them, it becomes taxable. It becomes tax. It's no longer a tax-free benefit. I keep on using the word tax, which isn't really an appropriate word there. It's tithing, right? It's liable for tithing. Once you salt it, it's liable for tithing. And since there's only tithing in the land of Israel, according to the Torah, and not in Babylonia, that's what we're talking about. Ba'aretz kavasvita, b'chutzal haaretz, outside of the land of Israel, lo kavasvita. It's not then liable for tithing, so therefore he can salt all he wants. He doesn't have to worry about it. It might even be, I'm going to throw this out at you and we're going to get to it. This business now suddenly where we've changed the subject and it's what makes something liable for tithing, if it applies to salting, it could also apply to cooking. The other things we've been talking about, cooking. Or maybe it also applies to eating two at a time. Maybe eating two is a meal. And if it's a meal, then it's a real solid benefit you're getting out of it, then maybe it becomes liable for tithing. All right, so it just introduces this. All right. Now, Rava discounts the difference between Israel and outside of Israel. However, he's not discounting this whole principle of what we should be discussing is what makes something liable for tithing or not. Okay. Rava's statement makes some sense to me, but it happens to be one of these statements. If you dig down deep into it and try to understand every word, it happens sometimes in the Talmud. So what we're going to do. Just because I think it's interesting, is read a kind of lengthy Steinsaltz note on Rava's comment and leave it at that. Okay? So, Amar Rava. Mi ikamidi de ba'aretz kavasvita. So Rava basically says, could it possibly be? Rava and Abai, by the way, both live in Babylonia. They both live outside of the land of Israel. So they understand so they live in Babylonia and they're living where agriculture now is D'Rabbanan and not D'Oraita. So Rava says, Mi kamidi, could it possibly consider de ba'aretz kavasvita, that in the land of Israel, salting would make something liable for taxation, me D'Oraita, according to the Torah, uva chutzal haaretz lo kavasvita, and then outside of the land, salting wouldn't make it required for tithing, umutar lechatchila, and you would be allowed to eat it, to salt it from the beginning. So it's hard to know exactly what that means. The logic doesn't flow. I'm going to read now with you the marginal note from Steinsaltz where it says background. Yeah. So background, the second one. Abai wishes to distinguish. Do you see that? Yeah. Abai wishes to distinguish between Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, and the rest of the world, and to argue that since the obligation to set aside tithes abroad is merely a rabbinic obligation, merely it has less force than a Torah obligation. Doesn't mean you can't do it, by the way. It means that once it's easier to overturn if you decide to overturn it. The sages were also lenient with respect to the details of tithing here, saying that the regular eating refers only to a true meal. All right. So Abai is saying, although we've got tithing, because we want to have it outside of the land of Israel, this is what Steinsaltz is suggesting, although we've got tithing, we're going to be a little bit more lenient about it, and we're going to say salting doesn't suddenly make you required for it. That's what Abai is saying. By contrast, Rava maintains that even when the sages issued rabbinic decrees, they endeavored to make their rulings similar to those of the Torah, and were careful not to create an entirely new structure of laws and regulations which might cause confusion and lead people into error. That's what Steinsaltz wishes that Rava had said. It's not quite what Rava had said. Now you might infer that that's kind of what Rava means. Like I said, it's actually just a hard sentence to translate. But I think that's more or less what Rava is getting at, is that they're not going to make such a huge... When they make their rabbinic rulings to make Babylonia similar in its agricultural rulings to Israel, they're not going to make broad exceptions. Why would they do that? I mean, the only reason that they would make rabbinic rulings is to make things more or less like the land of Israel. So they're not going to suddenly make a rabbinic ruling and say, but in this case, it's very different than the land of Israel. So that seems to be what Rava is saying. So Abai is their so Abai's solution that one takes place in Israel and one takes place outside of Israel for Rava doesn't work. Now, what I would say to counter Rava is that the rabbis would have all sorts of reasons for trying to distinguish Babylonia from the land of Israel. It could just be spiritual reasons to remind people, hey, we don't live in Israel. So we're not going to try to pretend that we live in Israel by making our legislation exactly like it was in Israel. So, I mean, if that was the goal, we wouldn't have an 8th day of Pesach, right? That's right. I mean, we have an 8th day of Pesach. I mean, the actual reason is nonsense now. Now we can look at a calendar and we know when Pesach ends, which was maybe the original reason, but we keep it because it's important to make a distinction between Israel and outside of Israel. We punish ourselves with an extra day of Pesach.
Yeah, it is a punishment.
Well, for some, I mean, you're not supposed to experience it that way. You could say it's a reward. It's a reward. We get an extra day. We get an extra holiday. But I guess the point is that we live our lives very much like the Jews in the land of Israel. However, it's also important for us in halakha to have distinctions to remind us that we don't live as redeemed a life. I think that's the theological basis for it. We don't live as redeemed a life as the Jews do in Israel, and we maintain that in the halakha. And so that's the problem to me with Rava's saying, well, we make these rules to make ourselves as similar to Israel as possible, but I don't think that's the idea. Anyway, Rava wins the argument, and Rava says that's not the distinction. Okay. Any questions? Okay. So here's what Rava says. Elamar Rava. Now, what Rava ends up doing is a very interesting, complicated, but I think useful summary of the whole discussion right now. Okay? He tries to solve everything. It's a grand unified theory. I talked about that last services, but it's not physics. It's about how much you can eat and not eat when you're an employer. By the way, we're sort of chuckling about this, but obviously this is very important stuff. This is an agricultural society, and people kind of living hand to mouth. And to get this down and to understand it was very, very important on a day-to-day basis. That's why there's a long discussion about it. It's not a theoretical discussion. So much in the Talmud is theoretical. This isn't. This is really, this is the day-to-day livelihood of virtually everybody.
To us, it doesn't seem like a big deal.
Right. Right.
But you can understand how the rabbis had to contend with people who were both workers as well as owners. Having to come to them to get the definition and the decisions based on that.
Right, that's right. Yeah. Okay. And it's day to day. You hire workers every day. This isn't like, once every 10 years there's going to be a lawsuit. This is every day. Okay. Elamar Rava. Ben ba'aretz, ben b'chutz ha'aretz. So Rava says, all this holds whether it's in Israel, whether it's outside of Israel. Chada lo kavasvita. If you just eat one, you're a worker. You eat one grape, one at a time, it doesn't make you liable for tithing. Tarte kavasvita. But if you throw two in your mouth at the same time, suddenly go ahead and do it. But you have to tithe. So you take those two and you take a tenth of those two and you owe it. You owe a tax on it. He's continuing. He's giving a bunch of general principles. Katzatz. However, you make a deal with what you're allowed to do with the landowner. Bein safat, uvein safat. whether you salt or don't salt. Achat ochel. You eat one at a time. Shtaim lo yochal. Okay, so the katzatz there, make a deal, refers to the non-picker, but just the person who's cleaning up. If he makes it, then he can salt or not salt. He's allowed to do that, but he can only eat one at a time, and he's not allowed to eat two at a time. Lo katzatz. Okay, he doesn't make a deal because velo safat, and he doesn't salt. Ochel shtaim. If in that case, because he's not salting, he can eat two at a time. Safat, if he salts, though, if he adds salt, achad ochel, just one at a time. Shtaim lo tochel. Okay. In other words, if he makes this deal, he's a non-agricultural worker. He can only do one of two things. He can add salt to enhance the flavor, or he can eat two at a time because he wants to do that. But he can't do both, one or the other. Okay. Page 200. The afal gavna natal reshut mi bal habayit. So again, even though he got permission from the owner, the reason he can either salt or eat two, but not both, is to eat bi'alahu l'maser, because as soon as he does one or the other, it becomes what we call tevel. Tevel is non-tithed. All right, and then he's eating. He's actually violating the Torah at that point by putting two in his mouth and salting.
No.
What?
That's a no-no.
Right. Well, right. At that point, it becomes taxable. It actually belongs to the priest. Part of it belongs to the priest. So he's violating Torah. So the telling is at that point he was not allowed to do it. All right. It's not that he has to tithe unless he tithes it ahead of time. Okay.
This is all Talmudic. This is not Torah-based.
Yeah, it's all right. Well, some of it is Torah-based. I mean, the Maser, tithing is in the Torah.
Tithing, but the two grapes is...
They're trying to figure out the salting the two grapes. Yeah, those are rabbinic interpretations.
Yeah.
Okay. So the eat be'alu l'maser, because it becomes what we call tevel, which is tithe produce that belongs to the priests. V'kavasvita, and at that point, salting makes, if it's two and you add salt, it makes it liable for if it's
Now when we had the temple, the tithing went to the priest, right?
Right.
But after, where did the tithing go?
Yeah, so it doesn't say.
Did it go to the Kohanim, or did it go to the government, or the?
It doesn't say. It doesn't say. However, it seems pretty clear it would go to the Jewish authorities. There was self-government.
Right.
It would go to fund the government.
Maybe the rabbis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were expenses. First of all, there was a big charity expense too. I mean, so there was charity funds.
Yeah.
There was also nobody got paid. I mean, that's interesting. Rabbis, judges didn't get paid, but I'm sure there were expenses. They had to travel and they had to have meals and things they had to. So I think it was to pay the Jewish bureaucracy for self-government.
But today, when a religious person in Israel still considers that he has to tithe, correct? Where does that money
I don't know.
go?
I'm not sure. I don't think
charity of his choice, or
So this is I'm just so removed from my experience. I don't think that I don't think they tithe.
They don't tithe.
I don't think they tithe because there's no temple. I don't think they tithe. But I mean, there's other agricultural laws they fulfill.
Right.
Like Shemitah, right? The sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, they do that because it's not connected to the temple.
Right.
But there's no. I don't think they tithe. You pay taxes to the government.
Right.
Yeah.
What I don't understand is the person who makes the deal has a worse situation than if he doesn't make a deal. If he makes a deal, he can only eat one at a time, whether he salts it or not. If he doesn't make a deal, he can eat one at a time if he salts it, but two at a time if he doesn't salt it.
But the thing is, the only reason he can eat it all is because he makes the deal. Because he makes the deal.
Otherwise he can't eat.
I thought it said lo katzatz.
No, but the only reason he can eat even one is because he makes the deal. Normally, he wouldn't be allowed to eat it all.
Well, what does it mean in 14? It says lo katzatz. I thought this didn't make sense.
What page are you?
On page 199, 14, it says lo katzatz.
Oh, if he didn't make a deal, let me just, if he did not sip it. And, so at that point.
So he has a better deal than the one who makes the deal. I don't get it.
Yeah, because I think that goes back to the agriculture, the picker who's picking, because he doesn't make a deal. So then,
it's a different person. Then.
It's a different person, yeah.
The one who's just hoeing at the one that's
That's why I didn't say that. I didn't stipulate that.
Said it earlier.
Stay with us, man.
All right. Yeah, we'll take two more and then.
I was going to say, I work in food service, and if you work in certain places where you worked and they had a union, there was part of the union contract that the kitchen workers could eat, in other areas they couldn't eat.
So a union contract would be like this, katzatz, except it's a whole group of people. They stipulate certain things. Yeah, what the analogy would be, it could be, and I don't know this at all, I doubt that it's an American law. It could be like it's American law. If you work in food service, eat as much as you want, or you get one sandwich. I mean, federal law could. I'm just saying could. But even if federal law had something, the union could negotiate something above and beyond that. They wouldn't be able to negotiate. But maybe they'd be able to negotiate less than that. You would never be able to do that in the Torah. So that's what you have here. You have laws from the Torah. But you also have the individual worker allowed to negotiate something above and beyond that.
Yeah. Well, the ritual with dipping food in salt.
Yeah.
And where do you trace it back historically or traditionally?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean,
something really important for them, kind of.
I think here, in this case, it's just flavor. It's just that's all. It's not ritual. It's not recalling the salt water in Egypt. And I think we have a memory of that. So in the Seder, of course, we're taught from the age 5 that we do it because of the salty salt water of the. Yet clearly, the origin of that is not a memory device like that. It's that people dipped for flavor, and there's all sorts of dips, and dipping is a very common part of eating. The question to ask is, when did they have salt shakers? When were salt shakers invented? Because obviously in ancient Israel, they didn't use salt shakers. They would dip things. And so spices were from dipping. Flavor enhancements came from dipping. So here we're not talking about any kind of ritual. We're talking about just enhancing the flavor. Right. So so maybe dipping is a way to have a little less of it. I don't know, just a little bit. The lesson from this is that you never need as much salt as you think. It's very important. You don't need as much salt as you think. We all Americans, we put so much salt on stuff. You could just dip. You dip a little. Yeah, but you don't need as much. Even for taste.
Is this some way related to dipping in Passover?
It is. It's related in the sense that the origin of that is taste and not the salt waters, and we later read into it that it represents the tears of the slaves.
But I think the Seder is reminiscent of a fancy meal.
A fancy meal where they would dip.
And a fancy meal, you have an appetizer and you dip your greens in salt water.
Right.
I mean, that's your salad dressing. So
yeah, that's right. In fact, it's so fancy that you have more than one dip. You dip more than once.
Well,
yeah.
Why?
All right.